I thought I knew everything about my wife of 42 years. Every freckle on her hands. Every sigh meant she was content. Every silence that said more than words ever could. I was wrong. Dead wrong. And I didn't discover just how wrong until I was standing in our empty bedroom, 3 days before strangers would call it theirs, holding a letter that had been hiding in the walls for 41 years. A letter that would shatter everything I thought I understood about the woman I loved, the life we built, and the man I believed myself to be. My name is Thomas Whitmore. I'm 70 years old, and until 18 months ago, I was a husband. Now I'm just a widower trying to figure out what that word actually means. They don't prepare you for this part, you know. Everyone talks about grief like it's this wave that crashes over you and then recedes. Nobody tells you it's more like water damage. It seeps into everything. It warps the floorboards. It stains the walls. It makes familiar rooms feel like they belong to someone else's life. The house was a 1950s colonial on Maple Street. Rebecca and I bought it in 1981 for $63,000. I remember the realtor said it had good bones. Rebecca said it had good light. I said it had a mortgage we could barely afford. We signed the papers the same month we found out she was pregnant with Emma. Rebecca cried in the car on the way home, not because she was scared, but because she was happy. That's the kind of woman she was. The kind who could look at uncertainty and find joy in it. We raised 3 kids in that house. Emma, David, and Rebecca. There's a growth chart still penciled on the kitchen door frame. Crayon marks on the basement stairs from when David decided he was Picasso at age 4. A crack in the living room window from Rebecca's softball. Every corner held a memory. Every room whispered with ghosts of birthday parties and Christmas mornings and teenage arguments and late-night conversations after the kids were asleep. That house wasn't just wood and nails. It was the architecture of our life together. But Rebecca's been gone for 18 months now. Pancreatic cancer? 4 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. The doctors said she probably didn't suffer much. I don't believe them. I think she suffered every single day, trying to smile for me, trying to pretend she wasn't scared, trying to make it easier on all of us right up until the end. That was Rebecca. Always making things easier for everyone else. After she died, the house became something else entirely. It became a museum. A mausoleum. I'd walk through rooms and hear her voice. I'd catch her scent in the hallway, that combination of vanilla lotion and the lavender sachets she kept in the linen closet. I'd turn the corner expecting to see her at the kitchen table with her crossword puzzle and her coffee in that chipped mug she refused to throw away. But she was never there. Just the absence of her. Just the crushing, suffocating weight of all that empty space. My kids started the campaign about 6 months after the funeral. Gentle at first. Emma would visit and mention how the yard was getting too big for me to maintain alone. David would call and talk about retirement communities with activities and social opportunities. Rebecca, always the blunt one, finally just said it outright during Sunday dinner. Dad, you're lonely? This house is too big. You need to be around people. She wasn't wrong. I was lonely. I am lonely. The kind of lonely that makes you understand why some people just give up and follow their spouses into the ground. But selling the house felt like betrayal. Like I was erasing Rebecca. Like I was saying, those 42 years didn't matter enough to preserve. How do you put a price on a life? How do you let strangers sleep in the bedroom where you made love to your wife for 4 decades? Where you held her hand during her nightmares? Where she took her last breath on a Tuesday morning while I whispered that it was okay to let go? Emma was the one who finally convinced me. She'd found a retirement community called Riverside Gardens, 40 minutes from her place in Connecticut. Private apartments. A library. Garden plots. Activities if you wanted them, privacy if you didn't. She showed me the brochure on a rainy afternoon in March, and something in her eyes made me realize what I'd been doing to my children. I'd been making them watch me die by inches. I'd been turning their inheritance into a shrine that trapped me inside my own grief. Maybe it's time, I told my reflection that night. The old man staring back at me looked tired. hollowed out. Rebecca would have hated seeing me like this. She always said life was for living, not for waiting to die. So I called Emma the next morning and told her to contact a realtor. The house sold in 11 days. A young couple with 2 kids, a golden retriever, and the kind of optimism Rebecca and I had when we first signed those papers. The husband's name was Jason. The wife's name was Claire. Their daughters were 6 and 8. They walked through the rooms with wonder in their eyes, already imagining their furniture, their family, and their future. Claire stopped in the kitchen and said, "This is where we'll have Christmas morning." I had to excuse myself to the bathroom and cry like a child. Closing was set for Friday, June 14th. 3 days away. I'd already moved most of my belongings to a storage unit. The furniture was sold or donated. The kids had taken what they wanted: photo albums, Rebecca's jewelry, and the ridiculous ceramic rooster she'd insisted on keeping even though it clashed with everything. The house was almost empty. Just a few boxes in the garage, some cleaning supplies, and me walking through rooms one last time, saying goodbye to the walls that had held us. Wednesday afternoon, I was in the master bedroom doing a final check, making sure I hadn't left anything in the closets, the drawers, or the spaces we'd filled with 42 years of accumulation. Rebecca's side of the closet was empty. I donated her clothes months ago, though I'd kept her favorite cardigan. The blue one. It's in my suitcase at the hotel where I've been staying this past week. I still sleep with it sometimes. I'm not proud of that, but I'm not ashamed either. I was about to leave when I remembered Rebecca's wedding ring. Not the one she was buried with. That was her mother's ring, the one she wore after we got married. I'm talking about her original wedding band, the simple gold one I'd given her in 1981 when we were 28 years old and couldn't afford anything fancy. She'd stopped wearing it after she gained weight in her 50s and it wouldn't fit anymore. She'd been heartbroken about that, even though I told her it didn't matter. She'd kept it in a jewelry box on her dresser for years. About 5 years ago, maybe 6, I'd been getting dressed for a funeral. Tom Hendricks from down the street, heart attack at 63, and I'd knocked the jewelry box off the dresser. The ring had rolled across the floor and disappeared. We'd looked for hours. Moved furniture. Checked every crack and crevice. Nothing. Rebecca had cried that night. Not sobbing, just quiet tears. "It's a sign," she'd said. "We're losing pieces of ourselves, and we can't get them back." I'd held her and promised we'd find it. We never did. But Wednesday afternoon, standing in that empty closet, I suddenly knew where it had gone. There was a baseboard along the back wall that had always been a little loose. Rebecca used to joke about mice living behind it. I got down on my knees, not easy at 70 with bad joints, and pulled at the board. It came away easily, and there in the dust and darkness was the gold band, still shining after all these years. I reached for it, and that's when my fingers brushed against paper. Not just paper. An envelope. Yellowed with age. Thick. Substantial. I pulled it out into the light, and my heart stopped. My actual heart felt like it stopped beating for 3 full seconds. My name was on the front. Thomas, in Rebecca's handwriting. Her young handwriting, the way she used to write before arthritis bent her fingers. The envelope was sealed. And in the corner, barely visible, she'd written a date. April 1983. 41 years ago. 2 years after we bought the house. 6 months after Emma was born. I sat there on the closet floor, holding this envelope, and I couldn't move. My hands were shaking. My mouth was dry. Every instinct screamed at me to open it, but another part of me, the part that had spent 18 months trying to hold on to the woman I thought I knew, was terrified. Because you don't hide a letter behind a baseboard unless it's something that matters. Unless it's something secret. Unless it's something that changes things. The house was completely silent around me. No traffic outside. No neighbors. No life. Just me and this envelope and the ghost of my wife whispering through the walls. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and harsh. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips where they pressed against the paper. This was a moment, I realized. One of those moments where your life splits into before and after. Before you know it. After you know. Before you read. After you read. I thought about Rebecca in that moment. Really thought about her. Not the woman who'd been sick and dying. Not the ghost I'd been living with. But the real Rebecca. The woman who'd surprised me with spontaneous road trips. Who'd laugh so hard at stupid jokes she'd snort. Who'd once told me she dreamed of being a writer when she was young but gave it up to raise our family. Who'd volunteered at the library for 30 years, teaching kids to read, running literacy programs, and making a difference in quiet ways that never made headlines but changed lives. Had I really known her? I'd thought so. We'd been married for 42 years. We'd raised 3 children. We'd buried both sets of parents. We'd survived job losses and health scares and the ordinary catastrophes that make up a life. We'd made love thousands of times. We'd argued about money and parenting and whose turn it was to take out the trash. We'd sat together in comfortable silence reading separate books. We'd been partners. But a partner doesn't hide a letter for 41 years unless there's something they couldn't say out loud. Unless there's a truth too big or too painful or too complicated to share. Unless they're protecting you. Or protecting themselves. Or protecting the marriage from something that might tear it apart. I stood up slowly, my knees cracking in protest. I slipped the wedding ring into my pocket. I held the envelope against my chest like it might escape. And I walked out of that house for the last time, carrying a secret my dead wife had kept from me for 4 decades. The new family would move in on Friday. They'd fill those rooms with their laughter, and their arguments, and their future. But they'd never know what had been hidden in the walls. They'd never know what secrets a house can keep. I drove back to the Hampton Inn where I'd been staying. Room 247. I sat on the edge of the bed with the envelope in my lap. The curtains were drawn. The air conditioning hummed. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma asking if I needed help with anything before closing. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because I was about to open a letter from my dead wife, and I had absolutely no idea what it would say. What do you do when the person you loved most in the world leaves you a message from beyond the grave? What do you do when you realize that maybe, just maybe, you didn't know them as well as you thought? What do you do when the past suddenly becomes a mystery, and the woman you mourn might be someone you never fully understood? I opened the envelope. And everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my wife, and my life fell apart. I tore open the envelope with shaking hands, and the first thing that fell out wasn't the letter itself but a newspaper clipping. Yellowed. Brittle. From the Seattle Times, dated March 1983. The headline read, "Nonprofit seeks new director for Children's Literacy Initiative." And there, circled in red ink, was a job listing. Director of Programming. The Children's Reading Foundation. Seattle, Washington. Salary, $45,000. In 1983, that was real money. That was more than I was making as a junior accountant. That was enough to change everything. My chest tightened. Why would Rebecca keep a job listing from Seattle? We never lived in Seattle. We never even talked about Seattle. We were Connecticut people. Born and raised. Our families were here. Our life was here. What was this doing hidden in our bedroom wall for 41 years? I unfolded the letter itself. 3 pages. Dense. Rebecca's handwriting covered every inch, front and back, like she'd had so much to say she couldn't waste even the margins. My eyes blurred as I tried to focus on the first line, and I realized I was crying. Not gentle tears. Gut-wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal. Because I knew, even before I read a single word, that this letter was going to hurt. That it was going to change me. That the woman I'd mourned for 18 months was about to become someone I didn't recognize. I forced myself to breathe. To focus. To read. "My dearest Thomas," it began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've finally found what I hid all those years ago. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for keeping this from you. But I need you to understand why I made the choice I did, and I need you to know that it was my choice. Not yours. Mine. The words swam before my eyes. What choice? What was she talking about? I kept reading, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out right there on that hotel bed. In February 1983, I was offered a job. The job, Thomas. The one I'd been dreaming about since college. Director of Programming at the Children's Reading Foundation in Seattle. They wanted me to design literacy programs for underprivileged children across the Pacific Northwest. They wanted me to travel, to speak, and to build something meaningful. They offered me $45,000 a year and the chance to make a real difference in the world. Not just in our town. Not just in our state. But everywhere. I stopped reading. Put the letter down. Stood up. Sat back down. My mind was reeling. Rebecca had been offered a job in Seattle? In 1983? The year Emma was born? And she never told me? Not once in 42 years of marriage had she mentioned this? I picked up the letter again, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold the paper steady. I found out I was pregnant with Emma 3 days after they offered me the position. 3 days, Thomas. Can you imagine? I'd been waiting my whole life for an opportunity like this, and the universe gave it to me at the exact moment when taking it became impossible. Because how could I? How could I drag you across the country when we just bought the house? When your mother had just been diagnosed with emphysema and your father was already showing signs of the dementia that would take him 5 years later? When we were just starting our life together, and I was carrying our first child. Oh God! Oh God, Rebecca! What did you do? I called them and turned it down. I told them I was flattered but that my life was in Connecticut. I didn't tell them I was pregnant. I didn't tell them about your parents. I didn't tell them that the real reason I was saying no was because I was terrified. Terrified that if I chose that job, I'd be choosing ambition over love, career over family, and my dreams over our future. And I couldn't do it, Thomas. I couldn't be the woman who abandoned her family for a paycheck, no matter how meaningful the work. The hotel room felt like it was spinning. I had to grip the edge of the bed to steady myself. She turned down her dream job. For me. For us. For a life I thought she'd chosen freely, happily, without reservation. But she hadn't. She'd sacrificed. She'd given up something she wanted desperately. And I'd never known. Never suspected. Never asked if she was happy with the choices we'd made together, or rather, the choices she'd made alone. But the letter wasn't finished. There was more. So much more. I need you to understand something, Thomas. I need you to know that I don't regret the choice I made. Not exactly. But I won't lie and say it didn't haunt me. For years, I'd see articles about the foundation. I'd read about the programs they were building and the children they were helping, and I'd think, that could have been me. I could have done that. I could have mattered in that way. And then Emma would wake up crying, or David would skin his knee, or Rebecca would bring home a drawing from school, and I'd remember why I'd chosen this instead. But the wondering never completely went away. The what-ifs lingered like shadows in the corners of rooms. I felt sick. Actually physically sick. I stumbled to the bathroom and threw up, heaving into the toilet until there was nothing left. I splashed cold water on my face and looked at myself in the mirror. The old man staring back at me looked hollow. Destroyed. Because how had I not known? How had I lived with this woman for 4 decades and never seen the shadows she was talking about? How had I been so blind, so self-absorbed, so comfortable in our life that I'd never once asked her if she was truly happy? I went back to the bed. Picked up the letter. Kept reading, even though every word felt like a knife. I'm not telling you this to hurt you, my love. I'm telling you because I need you to know me completely. Not just the parts one lets you see, but all of me. The woman who loved you and the woman who wondered what her life might have been if she'd been braver, or more selfish, or less afraid. I need you to know that I hid this letter here because someday, when you were ready to let go of the house, you'd find it. And you'd understand that marriages aren't just made of the moments we share. They're made of the moments we choose not to share, the sacrifices we make silently, and the dreams we bury so others can flourish. Tears were streaming down my face. I wasn't sobbing anymore. Just crying quietly, steadily, like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Because she was right. I hadn't known her completely. I'd known the version of Rebecca she'd allowed me to see. The devoted wife. The loving mother. The woman who seemed content with our ordinary life in our ordinary house in our ordinary town. But beneath that, hidden like this letter behind a loose baseboard, was another Rebecca. One who'd wanted more. One who'd dreamed bigger. One who'd sacrificed those dreams and then lived for 40 years with the ghost of what might have been. Your parents needed us close, Thomas. You know that. Your mother died in 1988, and your father in 1992, and they died knowing their son was nearby. Knowing their grandchildren visited every Sunday. Knowing they weren't alone. If I'd taken that job, if I'd moved us to Seattle, they would have died alone or in some facility surrounded by strangers. I couldn't do that to them. More importantly, I couldn't do that to you. You loved your parents deeply. Caring for them in their final years gave you peace. It gave you closure. How could I rob you of that? She was right again. Of course she was right. My parents had needed us. Dad's dementia had gotten so bad by the end that he didn't recognize anyone except me. Some days, even I was a stranger to him. But on his good days, when clarity flickered behind his eyes, he'd hold my hand and say, "I'm glad you're here, son." Mom's emphysema had turned every breath into a battle, and knowing Emma and David and baby Rebecca were close by had given her something to fight for. They died in their own home, surrounded by family, with dignity. If we'd been in Seattle, they would have died in a nursing home in Connecticut, or we would have had to move them across the country, away from their friends, their community, and everything familiar. Rebecca had known this. She'd seen it before I'd even had to think about it. And she'd made the choice that protected everyone except herself. But here's what I need you to hear, Thomas. Really hear. I chose you. I chose us. Not because I had to. Not because society expected it. Not because I was weak, or afraid, or unable to imagine another path. I chose you because when I weighed everything, the job, the prestige, the impact I could have had, against the life we could build together, you won. Love won. Not just romantic love, but the love of creating a family, of being present for our children, of building something lasting and real. The Seattle job would have been extraordinary. But you were everything. I had to stop reading again. Had to process what she was saying. Because there was something in her words that I couldn't quite grasp. Something that felt both true and incomplete. She said she'd chosen me? But had she? Really? Or had she chosen obligation? Had she chosen fear? Had she chosen the safe path because taking the risky one felt too selfish, too ambitious, and too much like the kind of woman she'd been taught not to be? Women of Rebecca's generation, our generation, were caught between two worlds. The generation before them had been housewives, period. The generation after them had been told they could have it all. But Rebecca's cohort? They were told they could choose. Career or family. Ambition or love. As if those things were mutually exclusive. As if wanting both made you greedy. As if the only way to be a good mother was to sacrifice everything else on the altar of domesticity. Had Rebecca really chosen freely? Or had she chosen the only option she'd felt was acceptable? And did it even matter? She was gone. She'd been gone for 18 months. I couldn't ask her these questions. I couldn't tell her that I would have supported her taking that job, that we could have figured it out together, that maybe, just maybe, she'd underestimated me. Underestimated us. But would I have supported it? Really? I tried to remember who I'd been in 1983. 20 years old. A new father. A man whose own father had raised him to believe that the husband provides and the wife nurtures. That men go to work and women keep the home. I'd never said those things out loud, had never thought of myself as traditional or sexist, but the truth was, I'd benefited from Rebecca's choice. I'd had a wife who was always home, who managed everything so I could focus on my career. who made my life easier in 1,000 invisible ways. If she'd taken that job, my life would have been harder. I would have had to step up more with the kids. I would have had to figure out childcare and cooking and all the things Rebecca handled so I didn't have to. My parents would have been my problem to solve, not our shared burden. And I was ashamed to realize, sitting there at 70 years old with my wife's letter in my hands, that I didn't know if I would have risen to that challenge. I wanted to believe I would have. But I honestly didn't know. The letter had one more page. I almost didn't want to read it, because the first 2 pages had already destroyed me. What more could there be? What other secrets had Rebecca kept? What other truths was I going to have to face about the life I'd thought we'd built together? I picked up the 3rd page. My eyes were so swollen from crying I could barely see the words. But I forced myself to focus. To finish what Rebecca had started 41 years ago. By now, you're probably wondering why I'm telling you this. Why I hid this letter instead of just talking to you. Why I kept this secret for our entire marriage. The truth is, Thomas, I was afraid. Afraid that if you knew what I'd given up, you'd feel guilty. That you'd look at me differently. That every time I was tired or frustrated or less than perfectly happy, you'd wonder if I was regretting my choice. And I didn't want that for us. I didn't want our marriage to be shadowed by my sacrifice. I wanted it to be about the life we were building, not the life I didn't have. Jesus, Rebecca. Jesus Christ. Even in this letter, even in this confession, you were protecting me. You were carrying this burden alone so I wouldn't have to carry it with you. That's not love. That's martyrdom. And I don't know which one hurts more, knowing you sacrificed or knowing you felt like you had to hide it from me. But I want you to find this letter after I'm gone because I need you to know something. I need you to know that I saw you, Thomas. I saw how hard you worked. I saw you come home exhausted every night and still play with the kids. I saw you take care of your parents with such tenderness and devotion. I saw you be a good man in a world that doesn't always reward goodness. And I need you to know that my choice wasn't about you being enough or not enough. It was about me deciding what kind of life I wanted to live, and what kind of woman I wanted to be. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. Emma is calling. I ignored it. I couldn't talk to anyone right now. Couldn't pretend I was okay when my entire understanding of my marriage had just imploded. The phone buzzed again. Text message. Dad, just checking in. Let me know you're okay. I typed back with trembling fingers. I'm fine. Talk tomorrow. A lie. But a necessary one. I looked back at the letter. Just a few more paragraphs left. I want you to know that I didn't waste my sacrifice. I built a different kind of legacy. I volunteered at the library for 30 years. I taught hundreds of children to read. I ran literacy programs in our community. I made a difference, just not on the scale I might have in Seattle. And you know what? Some days that felt like enough. Some days I'd see a kid I'd taught sound out their first full sentence, and I'd think, this is why I stayed. This is what matters. But other days I'd read about the foundation in Seattle expanding to 10 states, 20 states, and I'd feel the weight of what I'd given up. Both things can be true, Thomas. I can have lived a meaningful life and still wondered about the one I didn't live. That's the thing nobody tells you about marriage, about long partnerships. You think you know someone, but you only know the parts they show you. The edited version. The curated self they present to the world, even to the person they love most. And maybe that's necessary. Maybe complete honesty would destroy us all. Maybe we need our secrets, our private griefs, and our hidden disappointments. Maybe that's how we survive. But sitting there in that hotel room, I felt cheated. Cheated of the chance to know my wife fully. Cheated of the opportunity to tell her that her sacrifice mattered. That I saw it, even if I saw it 40 years too late. That if I could go back to 1983 and do it all over again, I'd tell her to take the job. I'd figure out my parents. I'd figure out the house. I'd figure out how to be a better partner. Because the weight she carried alone, that should have been ours to share. The final paragraph. The last words Rebecca would ever say to me. If you're reading this, my love, then I'm gone. And you're probably blaming yourself. You're probably thinking about all the ways you failed me, all the times you didn't ask if I was happy, and all the opportunities one missed because of choices we made together. Don't. Please don't. I chose you. I chose us. I chose a life where I tucked my children in every night and woke up beside you every morning. The Seattle job? That was ambition. That was pride. That was ego. But you, Thomas, you were my dream. The real one. The one that mattered. And I have no regrets. Not about loving you. Not about the life we built. Not about any of it. I just needed you to know that I had options. That I chose you freely. That my love for you wasn't default or obligation, but choice. Every single day, I chose you. And I'd choose you again. Forever. Your Rebecca. I folded the letter carefully. Slipped it back into the envelope along with the newspaper clipping. And I sat there in that hotel room for 3 hours, not moving, barely breathing, just trying to understand what I'd just learned. Trying to reconcile the Rebecca I'd known with the Rebecca who'd written this letter. Trying to figure out if her sacrifice had been noble or tragic. If our marriage had been beautiful or built on unspoken resentment. If love was really enough to justify giving up your dreams. The truth is, I didn't have answers. I still don't. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had to tell someone. I couldn't carry this alone the way Rebecca had. I couldn't spend the rest of my life haunted by this letter, wondering if I'd stolen something precious from the woman I loved. I needed perspective. I needed help. I needed my children. So I did something I hadn't done in 18 months. I called a family meeting. I texted Emma, David, and Rebecca. Can you all video call tomorrow night? 8 p.m. It's important. About Mom. 3 responses came within minutes. Emma. Of course. Is everything okay? David. I'll be there. Rebecca. What's going on, Dad? I didn't respond. Couldn't explain over text. This required seeing their faces. Hearing their voices. Sharing this burden the way Rebecca should have been able to share it with me. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in that hotel bed, holding Rebecca's letter against my chest the way I held her cardigan, and I replayed our entire marriage in my mind. Looking for signs I'd missed. Moments where she'd seemed sad or distant or less than fully present. Times when I should have asked more questions, paid closer attention, and been a better partner. And you know what I found? Nothing. And everything. Because of course there had been moments. Quiet sighs. Faraway looks. Times she'd stare out the window longer than necessary. But I'd dismiss them as normal. As the ordinary disappointments that come with being human. I'd never imagined they were echoes of a dream deferred. The next evening, I set up my laptop on the hotel desk. 8 p.m. exactly. Emma's face appeared first, then David's, then Rebecca's. All 3 of them were looking concerned. Emma spoke first. Dad, you're scaring us. What's going on? Are you sick? I shook my head. Held up the envelope so they could see it. I found something. In the house. Behind a loose baseboard in the bedroom. A letter from your mother. Written in 1983. The concern on their faces shifted to confusion. Rebecca leaned closer to her camera. A letter? What kind of letter? I took a deep breath. A letter about a choice she made. A choice I never knew about. A choice that changed everything about the life we lived together. And then I read it to them. Every word. From the job offer to the pregnancy to the sacrifice to the final paragraph about choosing me. My voice broke multiple times. I had to stop and compose myself. But I read it all. When I finished, there was silence. Complete, crushing silence. I looked at their faces on the screen, and I saw my own shock and grief mirrored back at me. Emma was crying. David's jaw was clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. Rebecca had her hand over her mouth. Finally, Emma spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper. Mom gave up her dream job? For us? And she never told anyone? I nodded. She never told me. Never even hinted at it. I had no idea, Emma. No idea she'd wanted something different. Something more. David cleared his throat. Was she unhappy? All those years? Was she miserable, and we just never saw it? That was the question, wasn't it? The one that had kept me up all night. The one I couldn't answer. I don't know. She said in the letter that she didn't regret it. That she chose us freely. But she also said the what-ifs haunted her. That she wondered about the life she didn't live. So was she happy? Completely happy? I don't think so. But was she miserable? I don't think that either. I think she was something in between. Something more complicated than either happiness or regret. Rebecca, always the most direct of my children, asked the question I'd been dreading. Dad, would you have supported her if she told you? If she'd said she wanted to take the job and move us to Seattle? I met her eyes through the screen. And I told her the truth. I don't know. I want to say yes. I want to believe I would have been supportive and flexible and everything a good partner should be. But I was 20 years old. My parents were sick. We just bought a house. We had a baby on the way. And I'd been raised to believe that fathers provide and mothers nurture. So honestly, I don't know if I would have stepped up. I don't know if I was capable of being the man your mother needed me to be. And that destroys me, Rebecca. It destroys me to realize that maybe, she was right not to tell me. Maybe she knew I wouldn't support it. Maybe she knew I'd say all the right things but resent her for disrupting our life. Maybe she protected herself by keeping it secret. The silence that followed was even heavier than before. Because I'd just admitted something terrible. I'd admitted that I might have been the reason Rebecca sacrificed. Not directly. Not explicitly. But through the unspoken expectations and traditional roles that we both internalized and never questioned. Emma wiped her eyes. When she spoke, her voice was stronger. Dad, I think we need to understand something. Mom made a choice. You didn't force it on her. Society didn't force it on her. She weighed her options and chose what felt right at the time. And yeah, maybe it cost her something. Maybe she wondered what if. But look at what she gained. She was there for every school play, every scraped knee, and every heartbreak. She taught hundreds of kids to read. She built a community around literacy in our town. She had a full life, just not the life she'd originally imagined. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's what growing up means. Adjusting your dreams to fit the life you're actually living, not the fantasy version you had at 25. David nodded slowly. I remember Mom at the library. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, she'd be there with the reading circle. Kids loved her. She made reading feel like magic. She did make a difference, Dad. Just because it wasn't Seattle doesn't mean it didn't matter. But Rebecca wasn't convinced. That's easy to say when you're not the one who gave something up. I'm not saying Mom was wrong to choose family. I'm saying we should acknowledge what it cost her. Because this is exactly what happens to women, especially women of Mom's generation. They're told they can choose, but really there's only one acceptable choice if you want to be considered a good mother. And Mom made that choice, and she carried the weight of it alone, and now Dad gets to feel guilty about it even though she specifically told him not to. The whole thing is tragic. She was right. Of course she was right. This wasn't just about Rebecca and me. It was about every woman who'd been forced to choose between ambition and family. Every mother who'd been made to feel selfish for wanting more than domestic bliss. Every wife who'd sacrificed in silence because asking for more felt like betrayal. We talked for another 2 hours. We cried together. We tried to make sense of what this letter meant for how we understood our mother, our family, and our history. And slowly, something shifted. Because as painful as this revelation was, there was also something beautiful in it. Rebecca had trusted that eventually I'd find this letter. That eventually I'd be ready to know the truth. She'd hidden it where only I would find it, in the most intimate space of our marriage, our bedroom. She'd wanted me to know her completely, but only when she wasn't there to see the hurt in my eyes. Only when I had time and space to process it without feeling like I had to immediately fix it or reassure her. Before we ended the call, Rebecca said something that stopped me cold. "Dad, have you thought about why Mom hid the letter there? Behind that specific baseboard?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" "That's where her wedding ring fell. The one she couldn't wear anymore. The symbol of your marriage. She hid the letter in the exact same spot. Do you think that's a coincidence?" I felt my breath catch. No. It couldn't be a coincidence. Rebecca was too deliberate, too thoughtful. She'd hidden the letter behind the baseboard where her wedding ring had disappeared. The ring that symbolized our young love, our beginning, and the promises we made when we were too young to understand what we were promising. And the letter was the truth beneath those promises. The cost of keeping them. The sacrifice that made them real. After we hung up, I sat alone in that hotel room, holding the letter and thinking about symbolism. About hidden things. About marriages as constructions with loose boards and secret spaces. About love as something both beautiful and complicated. Both chosen and costly. And I realized something. I couldn't move forward until I understood more. The letter had answered some questions, but it had raised so many others. Had Rebecca really been at peace with her choice? Had there been other moments, other opportunities she'd turned down? Had she talked to anyone about this? Friends, family, anyone who might help me understand who she'd really been beneath the role of wife and mother? There was one person who might know. Susan Carmichael. Rebecca's best friend from college. They'd stayed close over the years, meeting for lunch monthly and talking on the phone weekly. If Rebecca had confided in anyone, it would have been Susan. I hadn't spoken to Susan since the funeral. But I knew she still lived in Hartford, about an hour away. And I knew I needed to talk to her. Because here's what I'd learned from that letter. Sometimes the people we love most are also the people we know least. Sometimes marriage is built on silence as much as communication. Sometimes sacrifice looks like love, and sometimes love requires sacrifice. And sometimes we can't tell the difference until it's too late. I picked up my phone and called Susan. She answered on the third ring. "Thomas? Is that you?" "Hi, Susan. I'm sorry to call out of the blue, but I need to talk to you about Rebecca. About something I found. Can I come see you? Tomorrow, maybe?" There was a pause. Then, "Of course. Come for lunch. I'll make tea. Thomas, is everything all right?" I looked at the letter in my lap. At the newspaper clipping. At the evidence of my wife's secret interior life. "No," I said honestly. "Nothing's all right. But maybe you can help me understand." "I'll see you tomorrow," she said. And I heard something in her voice. Something that sounded like she'd been waiting for this call. Like she'd known, someday, I'd find out. Like she'd been keeping Rebecca's secret too. I hung up and stared at the ceiling of that hotel room. Tomorrow I'd drive to Hartford. Tomorrow I'd sit across from Susan and ask her to tell me about the woman I'd married. The real woman. Not the edited version I'd lived with for 42 years, but the complicated, conflicted, dreaming woman who'd hidden letters in walls and carried grief in silence. And maybe, just maybe, I'd finally understand what Rebecca had really meant when she said she'd chosen me. Whether it had been a choice or a surrender. Whether love had been enough or if she'd needed more than I'd ever given her. Whether our marriage had been everything she'd wanted or just the best version of what she'd been allowed to want. The questions kept me awake all night. And I knew, deep in my bones, that the answers would change me forever. The next morning, I drove to Hartford with Rebecca's letter in the passenger seat beside me, like she was riding with me one last time. The summer sun was bright, almost offensive in its cheerfulness, and I kept thinking about how many times Rebecca and I had driven this route together over the years. Visiting Susan for dinner parties. Picking up specialty items from that Italian market she loved. Just driving for the sake of driving, back when we were young and time felt infinite. But this trip was different. This trip, I was driving toward answers I wasn't sure I wanted, to meet a woman who might tell me my entire marriage had been built on secrets I'd been too comfortable to notice. Susan lived in a Victorian house near Elizabeth Park, the kind of place Rebecca had always admired. "Look at that gingerbread trim," she'd say whenever we passed houses like this. "Look at those gardens. That's a house that's loved." I'd always thought she was just appreciating architecture. Now I wondered if she'd been mourning the life she might have had if she'd taken that Seattle job. If she'd been successful and independent and able to afford a house that was more than just functional. A house that was beautiful. I pulled into Susan's driveway at 11:30, exactly on time because punctuality was one of those habits you can't break even when your world is falling apart. Susan opened the door before I could knock, and the first thing I noticed was that she'd been crying. Her eyes were red and swollen, and she held a tissue in one hand like a flag of surrender. "Thomas," she said, and pulled me into a hug that felt like an apology. "Come in. I've made tea and sandwiches, though I don't know if either of us will be able to eat." We sat in her sunroom, surrounded by plants and natural light, and I pulled out the letter. Slid it across the table toward her. "Did you know about this?" Susan didn't pick it up. Just looked at it like it might bite her. "Yes," she said quietly. "I knew. Rebecca told me about the Seattle job when it happened. We were close then. We'd been roommates in college and stayed friends after. She called me the day she got the offer, and she was so excited, Thomas. So genuinely thrilled. And then she called me 3 days later to tell me she turned it down because she was pregnant, and your parents needed you nearby. And I could hear it in her voice, the grief. The weight of choosing. I felt my chest tighten. Why didn't she tell me? Why did she tell you but not her own husband?" Susan finally met my eyes. "Because you would have told her to take it. Or you would have felt guilty that she didn't. Or you would have tried to fix it, make it work, and upend your whole life to accommodate her dream. And Rebecca didn't want that. She didn't want her choice to become your burden. She wanted it to be hers alone. That's not how marriage works," I said, and my voice came out harder than I'd intended. "You don't make life-altering decisions alone. You talk about them. You figure them out together. That's the whole point of partnership." Susan smiled sadly. "Is it? Thomas, I loved you and Rebecca as a couple. You were good together. But don't romanticize it. Every marriage has its silences. Every partnership has its unspoken agreements. Rebecca knew that if she told you about Seattle, you'd either feel obligated to support a move you didn't want, or you'd convince her to stay and she'd resent you for it. This way, it was her choice. Clean. Final. No resentment, no guilt, no what-ifs about what you should have done differently. But that's exactly what I was feeling now. Guilt. Resentment. What-ifs. All the things Rebecca had tried to protect me from by keeping her secret. I was drowning in them anyway because she'd left the letter for me to find. So what was the point? What had she gained by hiding it while she was alive if she was just going to reveal it after her death? I asked Susan this, and she said something that stopped me cold. "Thomas, have you considered that maybe Rebecca wanted you to find the letter after she was gone because that's when you need it most? Not when you were married and building a life together, but when you were alone and trying to figure out what that life had meant. She knew you'd grieve. She knew you'd question everything. She knew you'd wonder if you'd given her enough, loved her enough, seen her enough. And she left you that letter as proof that you had. That she'd chosen you freely. That her love was real, even if it came with sacrifice." I sat with that for a long moment. The tea Susan had poured grew cold between us. Outside, I could hear children playing in a neighbor's yard, their laughter bright and uncomplicated. And I thought about what Susan was saying. That Rebecca's letter wasn't about burden or guilt. It was about truth. Complete, complicated, costly truth. She'd wanted me to know all of her, the parts that chose me and the parts that wondered about another path. And she'd waited until after her death to tell me because only then could I receive it without trying to fix it or apologize for it, or change the past. "Susan," I said slowly, "was Rebecca happy? In our marriage? With the life we built?" Susan reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were warm and soft and reminded me of Rebecca's touch. She was happy, Thomas. Not in some fairy tale way where everything was perfect and she never had doubts, but in the real way. The way that matters. She loved you. She loved your children. She loved the life you built together. And yes, sometimes she wondered what might have been. Sometimes she'd see news about the Children's Reading Foundation and feel a pang of loss. But then Emma would call, or David would visit, or Rebecca would send pictures of her kids, and Rebecca would say to me, "This is what I chose. This is what mattered." She meant it, Thomas. She really did. But the letter, I said. The way she wrote about the what-ifs haunting her. That doesn't sound like someone at peace with her choices. Peace isn't the same as the absence of doubt, Susan said. Rebecca made peace with her choice by acknowledging both its cost and its value. She didn't pretend the sacrifice didn't exist. She didn't lie to herself about what she'd given up. But she also didn't let that define her entire life. She built something meaningful in the space she'd chosen. The library programs. The literacy work. The thousands of hours she spent teaching kids to read. That was her legacy, Thomas. Different from Seattle, but no less important. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her so badly it hurt. But there was still something nagging at me. Something I couldn't quite articulate. Finally, I managed to voice it. Did she ever resent me? Even a little bit? Did she ever look at me and think, he's the reason I gave up my dream? Susan was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but unflinching. Honestly, I think there were moments. Brief flashes of resentment when things were hard. When the kids were sick and you were traveling for work. When your parents needed constant care and she was doing most of it. When she was exhausted and underappreciated and feeling invisible. In those moments, I think she wondered what her life would have been like if she'd chosen differently. But Thomas, those moments exist in every marriage. Every partnership. Everyone wonders sometimes if they made the right choice, took the right path, or married the right person. What matters is what you do with those moments. And Rebecca? She chose to stay. Every single day, even on the hard days, she chose to stay. That's love. Not the absence of doubt, but the choice to stay despite it. Something broke open inside me then. Not in a painful way, but in a way that felt like release. Like I'd been holding my breath for 3 days and could finally exhale. Because Susan was right. Marriage wasn't about never questioning, never doubting, never wondering about the road not taken. It was about choosing each other anyway. Again and again. Through the doubts and the disappointments and the ordinary heartbreaks that make up a shared life. Rebecca had chosen me. Not just in 1983 when she turned down Seattle. But every day after. When she woke up beside me. When she made dinner for our family. When she held my hand through my father's funeral. When she laughed at my terrible jokes. When she grew old with me. Every single one of those moments had been a choice. And the letter wasn't evidence that she'd regretted those choices. It was evidence that she made them consciously, fully, with her eyes open to what they cost. Susan, I said, tell me about the Rebecca I didn't know. The woman was before me. Before the kids. Before she became someone's wife and mother. Who was she? And Susan smiled. A real smile this time, warm and reminiscent. She was extraordinary. Smart as hell, top of our class in college. She wanted to change the world, Thomas. Not in some vague way, but specifically. She'd grown up poor, and books had been her escape. The library had been her sanctuary. She wanted to make sure every kid, especially poor kids, had access to that same escape. She was passionate and driven and so full of hope. When we graduated, she had this 5-year plan. Get a job with a nonprofit. Build programs. Make an impact. Eventually maybe write a book about childhood literacy. She had it all mapped out. And then she met me, I said quietly. And all those plans changed. She met you, Susan agreed. And she fell in love. And she had to figure out how to reconcile the woman she'd planned to be with the woman she was becoming. That's not your fault, Thomas. That's just life. We all do it, adjust our dreams to fit reality. The question isn't whether we adjust. It's whether we find meaning in what we build instead of what we'd originally imagined. Did she? Find meaning? Yes. Absolutely. The library programs she ran, those weren't small, Thomas. She taught hundreds of kids to read over 30 years. She created summer reading initiatives that are still running. She fought for funding when budgets were cut. She made literacy accessible in a community that desperately needed it. It wasn't Seattle. It wasn't national. But it was real. It mattered. She knew it mattered. We talked for another hour. Susan told me stories about Rebecca I'd never heard. About her college activism, her early career ambitions, and her dreams of traveling to promote literacy internationally. And with each story, I felt like I was meeting my wife for the first time. Not the edited version she'd shown me, but the full, complex, ambitious woman she'd been before she'd narrowed herself to fit into the role of Thomas Whitmore's wife. It was painful. But it was also beautiful. Because I realized that Rebecca had trusted me enough to leave that letter. Trusted that eventually, I'd be ready to know all of her. Trusted that our love was strong enough to hold both the woman I'd known and the woman I'd never fully seen. Before I left, Susan said one more thing. Thomas, Rebecca told me something else. About 2 years before she died. We were having lunch, and out of nowhere she said, I want Thomas to know. After I'm gone. I want him to know about Seattle. About the choice I made. I want him to know I chose him freely. I asked her why it was important. And she said, because when you lose someone, you tend to idealize them. Make them into saints who never doubted, never struggled, and never wanted anything beyond what they had. I don't want Thomas to do that to me. I want him to know I was human. Complicated. Full of contradictions. And I still chose our life together. That's more meaningful than sainthood. I drove home, not to the hotel, but to the retirement community where I'd moved the week before. Riverside Gardens. My new one-bedroom apartment still felt like someone else's space. But as I unlocked the door and walked into the empty rooms, I realized something. This wasn't a hotel where I was waiting for life to resume. This was my life now. This was what Rebecca's choice had led to, a widower at 70, starting over, trying to figure out who he was without the woman who'd defined him for 4 decades. I unpacked the boxes I'd been avoiding, set up my furniture, hung pictures on the walls, and in the center of the living room, I placed a photograph of Rebecca from our wedding day. Young, radiant, full of dreams she'd had to adjust but never abandoned them. And beside it, I placed a letter. Framed. Not hidden. A reminder that love isn't simple. That marriage isn't fairy tales. That sometimes the deepest love comes with the deepest sacrifice. And acknowledging that doesn't diminish the love, it honors it. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since Rebecca died. I went to the community center at Riverside Gardens. They were having a social hour, coffee and cookies, residents mingling, and a woman at the piano playing old standards. I almost turned back. The old Thomas would have. The Thomas who'd spent 18 months hiding in an empty house, afraid to move forward because moving forward felt like betrayal. But I thought about Rebecca's letter. About her choosing to stay even when she'd wanted more. About her finding meaning in the life she'd built rather than mourning the life she'd imagined. And I walked through that door. An older woman approached me almost immediately. Silver hair. Bright eyes. A smile that felt genuine. You're new, she said. I'm Patricia. Welcome to Riverside. Thomas, I said. I moved in last week. How are you settling in? And here's where I surprised myself. Instead of giving the polite, surface answer, fine, good, adjusting, I told the truth. It's hard. I'm widowed. 18 months. Just sold the house my wife and I lived in for 42 years. Found something in the house that's made me question everything I thought I understood about my marriage. So honestly, I'm not settling in. I'm drowning. But I'm here anyway because I think that's what she would have wanted. Patricia didn't look uncomfortable or awkward. She just nodded. I lost my husband 7 years ago. Cancer. And I'll tell you what someone told me that actually helped. You're not betraying them by moving forward. You're honoring them by living the life they can't live anymore. Come on. Let me introduce you to the other widowers. We have a group that meets Thursday mornings. Call ourselves the Breakfast Club. Mostly we just complain and tell inappropriate stories about our late spouses. But it helps. I followed her. And over coffee and stale cookies I met Richard, who'd lost his wife 5 years ago. And James, who'd been widowed 3 years. And Frank, who'd lost his husband just 6 months before. And they asked about my story? So I told them. About Rebecca. About the letter. About discovering that the woman I'd loved had sacrificed more than I'd ever known. And Richard said, my wife gave up her art career to raise our kids. Didn't find out until after she died and I was going through her studio. Found painting after painting she'd never shown anyone. Never tried to sell. Just painted for herself because she'd given up on the dream of being a professional artist. Broke my heart. But it also made me understand her better. The quiet sadness I'd sometimes see in her eyes. The way she'd stare at art galleries like she was mourning something. I thought I'd failed her. But then my daughter said something smart. She said, Mom didn't fail at being an artist. She succeeded at being exactly who she chose to be. Both things can be true. James nodded. My Jean was offered a promotion that would have required relocating. She turned it down because my mother was sick and needed us nearby. She never told me she'd gotten the offer. Found out from her old boss at the funeral. He mentioned how much he'd wanted to hire her, how impressed he'd been, and how disappointed he'd been when she'd declined. I was furious at first. Felt like she'd lied to me by omission. But then I realized she'd made a choice. A hard choice. And she'd made it based on what she valued most. That wasn't weakness. That was strength. Frank, the youngest of us at 65, said quietly, I think we all carry secrets from our partners. Not because we don't love them, but because some things are too complicated to explain. Too personal. Too much ours and not theirs. And maybe that's okay. Maybe perfect transparency isn't the goal. Maybe the goal is loving someone enough to let them keep parts of themselves private, and trusting that what they share is the truth, even if it's not the whole truth. We talked until the social hour ended and the staff started cleaning up. And when I walked back to my apartment that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in 18 months. Not happiness, exactly, but possibility. The sense that maybe I could build a life here. Maybe I could find purpose and meaning and even joy in this next chapter. Not because I'd forgotten Rebecca or moved on from her, but because I was finally understanding what she tried to tell me in that letter. That love isn't about perfect understanding. It's about choosing each other despite imperfect understanding. It's about building something meaningful in the space you're given, even if that space isn't what you'd originally imagined. The next week, I did something that felt both terrifying and necessary. I contacted the local library, the same library where Rebecca had volunteered for 30 years. I asked if they needed volunteers for their literacy program. The director, a woman named Alicia who'd worked alongside Rebecca, almost cried when I told her who I was. Rebecca talked about you all the time, she said. She'd be so proud that you're carrying on her work. I started volunteering twice a week. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, the same schedule Rebecca had kept. I worked with kids from low-income families, helping them sound out words, discover the magic of stories, and build confidence in their reading abilities. And I understood, finally, what Rebecca had meant when she'd said this work mattered. Because I could see it. In the moment a 7-year-old successfully read their first full sentence. In the pride on a mother's face when her child brought home their first library book. In the way literature opened worlds for kids who desperately needed escape from their circumstances. This was Rebecca's legacy. Not the Seattle job she turned down. not the national programs she might have built. But this direct, tangible, life-changing work happened one child at a time. And it was beautiful. More beautiful than I'd ever recognized when she was alive. 3 months into volunteering, I started something new. I suggested to Alicia that we create a group at Riverside Gardens. Not for kids, but for seniors. A space where widows and widowers could come together and talk about the things they'd never said to their late spouses. The regrets. The questions. The discoveries that came after death when you were going through someone's belongings and finding evidence of lives you'd never fully seen. We called it The Unsaid Things. And it met every Wednesday evening in the community room at Riverside. Patricia came. Richard, James, and Frank came. Others joined. At its peak, we had 15 regular members. And each week, someone would share a story. About finding a journal that revealed their spouse's secret depression. About discovering an old love letter from before they met. About learning their partner had turned down opportunities, carried burdens, and made sacrifices they'd never mentioned. And we'd sit with those stories. Acknowledge the pain and confusion and guilt they brought. But also celebrate them. Because each unsaid thing was evidence of complexity. Of interior lives. Of the truth that we can love someone deeply without knowing them completely. And that's okay. That's human. That's real. One evening, about 6 months after I'd found Rebecca's letter, a woman named Dorothy shared her story. Her husband had been a veteran with PTSD. He'd never talked about his service, and she'd never pushed. But after he died, she found hundreds of letters he'd written but never sent. Letters to his therapist. Letters to fellow veterans. Letters to her, explaining things he'd been too afraid or ashamed to say out loud. And in those letters, she'd discovered a man she'd never fully known. A man who'd been suffering in ways she'd never recognized. A man who'd loved her but hadn't known how to show it without also showing his wounds. I spent the first year after his death angry, Dorothy said. Angry that he'd hidden so much. Angry that he'd suffered alone. Angry that he'd loved me but hadn't trusted me enough to be vulnerable. But then I realized something. He did trust me. Just not with his trauma. He trusted me with his peace. With the parts of himself that were healthy and whole and capable of love. And maybe that was the greatest gift he could give me. Not his brokenness, but his healing. I thought about that a lot in the weeks that followed. About what we owe each other in relationships. Whether we're obligated to share every part of ourselves, or whether it's okay, even necessary, to keep some things private. To protect our partners from our darkest thoughts. To shoulder certain burdens alone so the people we love can live lighter. Rebecca had made that choice. To carry the weight of her what-ifs alone so I wouldn't have to carry them with her. And I'd been judging that choice as dishonest or cowardly. But maybe it was actually the opposite. Maybe it was brave. Maybe it was the deepest form of love, sacrificing not just opportunities but also the need to be fully known so the person you love can be happy. I'll never know for certain. Rebecca's gone. I can't ask her to clarify. I can't tell her I understand now or that I'm sorry I didn't see her more clearly while she was alive. All I can do is honor her choice by living the life she made possible. By being grateful for what she gave me rather than guilty about what it cost her. By finding meaning in the same way she did, through small, consistent acts of service that might not change the world but absolutely change individual lives. A year after finding the letter, I returned to the house on Maple Street. The young family had settled in beautifully. Their kids' artwork covered the refrigerator. A swing set had been installed in the backyard. The gardens Rebecca had tended were blooming under Claire's care. It looked like a home full of life and love and the chaotic joy of childhood. I'd asked if I could visit, and Claire had graciously agreed. We sat in the kitchen, my old kitchen, their new kitchen, and drank coffee while her daughters played in the next room. I told her the story. About the letter. About Rebecca's sacrifice. About what I'd learned in the years since. Claire listened quietly. When I finished, she said, "Can I tell you something? I turned down a job too. Before we moved here. It was in Boston. better pay, better title, my dream company. But it would have meant Jason staying here with his job, me commuting, the kids in different schools, and our family fractured. And I couldn't do it. I chose this instead. This house. This life. Being present for my daughters. And some days I wonder what if. What if I'd been braver? More ambitious? Less traditional? But then Lily brings home a drawing from school, or Emma asks me to read her a story, and I remember why I chose this. I smiled. Does Jason know? About the job you turned down? She shook her head. No. I figured telling him would just make him feel guilty. Like he'd held me back. But he didn't. I chose. Just like your Rebecca chose. And that's important. Because if we frame every sacrifice as something imposed on us, we're denying our own agency. We're saying we're victims of circumstances. But if we own our choices, acknowledge that yes, they cost us something, but they also gave us something, then we're powerful. We're authors of our own lives, not just characters in someone else's story. I thought about that all the way home. About the agency. About choice. About the difference between sacrifice and surrender. And I realized that's what Rebecca had been trying to tell me in her letter. That she'd been the author of her own life. That even when circumstances constrained her options, she'd still chosen. And that choice had meaning precisely because it was hers. Now, standing here a full year later, I can tell you this. I still miss Rebecca every single day. I still reach for her in bed sometimes, forgetting for a half second that she's gone. I still see something funny and think, I have to tell Rebecca about this. Before remembering I can't. Grief doesn't end. It just changes shape. It becomes something you carry rather than something that carries you. But I've also built a new life. I volunteer at the library twice a week. I lead the Unsaid Things support group every Wednesday. I have friends at Riverside Gardens. I visit Emma regularly. She lives just 40 minutes away, and we have dinner every Sunday. David calls weekly. Rebecca sends pictures of her kids. My life is full in ways I never expected it could be after losing the person who'd been its center for 42 years. And I keep Rebecca's letter framed on my living room wall. Not as a monument to guilt or regret, but as a reminder. A reminder that love is complicated. That marriages are built on both what we say and what we leave unsaid. That sacrifice can coexist with joy. That we can make peace with our choices without pretending they were easy or costless. Every morning, I read the final paragraph of that letter. The part where Rebecca says she chose me. That I was her dream. That she'd choose me again, forever. And I believe her. Not because our marriage was perfect or because she never doubted or because love conquered all the challenges we faced. But because she chose me anyway. Every single day, she chose me anyway. And that's more meaningful than any fairy tale ending. Here's what I've learned in the years since I found that letter hidden in the walls of our old house. We don't fully know the people we love, and that's okay. We see what they show us. We understand what we're capable of understanding. And sometimes, after they're gone, we discover there were depths we never recognized. But that doesn't mean we loved them wrong. It means we loved them as humans love, imperfectly, incompletely, but genuinely. Rebecca gave up Seattle. She gave up her national ambitions. She gave up the version of herself she'd imagined becoming. But she didn't give up meaning. She didn't give up purpose. She didn't give up impact. She just found them in different places. In our kitchen, where she taught our kids to read. In the library where she taught hundreds of other kids to read. In the quiet, consistent work of building a life that mattered, even if it didn't make headlines. And me? I'm trying to do the same. To build meaning in this final chapter. To honor Rebecca by living fully rather than simply waiting to die. To acknowledge that yes, she sacrificed. Yes, it cost her. But also yes, she chose it. And that choice gave our children a present mother. It gave my parents dignity in their final years. It gave our community a literacy advocate who changed lives. And it gave me 42 years with a woman who loved me enough to stay even when leaving might have been easier. That's not tragedy. That's love. Real love. The kind that doesn't fit neatly into romance novels or inspirational quotes. The kind that's messy and complicated and sometimes tinged with regret, but also profound and lasting and worth every sacrifice it required. So here's my question for you. Because I've told you my story, and now I want to hear yours. What have the people you loved kept from you? What secrets have you kept from them? What choices have you made that cost you something but also gave you something? And can you hold both truths at once? The cost and the value, the sacrifice and the choice, the grief and the gratitude? I've learned that wisdom doesn't come from having all the answers. It comes from sitting with the questions. From accepting that life is more complicated than we'd like it to be. From honoring both what we've lost and what we've gained. Rebecca left me a letter that changed everything I thought I knew about our marriage. But she also left me a legacy. Of choosing love even when it's hard. Of finding meaning even when it's not what you'd imagined. Of living fully in the life you've been given rather than mourning the life you didn't live. I'm 71 years old now. I've been a husband, a father, a son, and a widower. I've lost the love of my life and discovered I didn't know her as well as I'd thought. I've felt crushing guilt and profound gratitude, sometimes in the same breath. I've learned that marriage is both more fragile and more resilient than I'd ever understood. And I'm still here. Still learning. Still growing. Still discovering that it's never too late to become someone new. It's never too late to find purpose. It's never too late to honor the people we've loved by living the lives they made possible. Rebecca chose me. Every day for 42 years, she chose me. And now, every day for whatever years I have left, I choose to honor that choice by living fully, loving deeply, and acknowledging that the most meaningful lives are often built on sacrifices we'll never fully understand. That's my story. That's the letter she hid. That's the truth I found behind a loose baseboard in an empty house 3 days before strangers called it home. Now it's your turn. What letters are hiding in your walls? What truths have you discovered too late? What choices are you grateful for, even if they cost you something? And most importantly, how will you honor the people who've shaped your life by living fully in the one you've been given? Share your story in the comments below. Tell me about the sacrifices you've witnessed or made. Tell me about the complicated love that doesn't fit neatly into happy endings. Tell me how you've found meaning in the spaces between what you'd hoped for and what you've received. Because that's where wisdom lives. In those spaces. In the acknowledgement that life is both harder and more beautiful than we ever imagined. And that somehow, impossibly, that's exactly as it should be. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own relationships differently, if it helped you sit with the complexity of love and sacrifice and choice, then please hit that like button. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe to Senior Wisdom Tales for more stories that honor the messy, complicated, beautiful truth of real life. Because we're not here to sell you fairy tales. We're here to remind you that your story, with all its imperfections and sacrifices and difficult choices, is exactly the story worth telling. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sitting with me in this grief and this gratitude. Thank you for understanding that sometimes the greatest act of love is carrying our burdens alone so the people we love can live lighter. And thank you for being part of this community, where we honor the truth that getting older doesn't mean having all the answers. It means getting better at living with the questions. Until next time, this is Senior Wisdom Tales, reminding you that the people we love most are often the people we know least, and that's not failure. That's the profound mystery of being human together.